If someone had told me a year ago that the man across the courtyard, the one whose sheer existence felt like a personal affront to my peace and quiet, would become the axis on which my world turned, I would have laughed. It would have been a hollow, anxious sound, the kind I mastered in my years of self-imposed solitude, but it would have been a laugh nonetheless. My life was a carefully curated collection of routines, a fortress built of silence and predictable rhythms. I was the king of a very small, very quiet castle, and from my window, I watched the world. More specifically, I watched him. His name was Julian. I only knew that from a piece of mail mistakenly delivered to my door. Julian Kowalski. The name felt solid, heavy like the man himself. He was a carpenter, a builder, something that involved dust and noise and sweat. His truck, a beast of a machine caked in a permanent layer of grime, would rumble to life at an ungodly hour of the morning, its engine a growl that vibrated through my floorboards and rattled my teeth. He was an invasion of sound and presence. He was tall, broad in a way that seemed carved from older, harder materials than the rest of the world. His arms were a roadmap of veins and sinew, his hands large and calloused. I saw him once, in the brutal heat of late August, lift a stack of lumber from the bed of his truck that looked like it should have required a crane. He moved with a thoughtless, physical confidence that I found both irritating and deeply, secretly, compelling. He was everything I was not. Solid, grounded, loud. I was a creature of quiet spaces and internal landscapes. A ghost in my own home. My castle was apartment 2B. His was the small, freestanding house just across the shared brick courtyard, 2A. Our front doors faced each other, separated by about 50 feet of weathered brick and a tragically neglected garden bed. This proximity felt both vast and suffocating. An uncrossable ocean, yet he was close enough that I could hear him cough on his porch in the evenings. Close enough that I had to angle my desk chair, just so, to keep him out of my peripheral vision, to stop myself from the constant, magnetic pull of looking up from my screen to see what he was doing. Most days, he was a whirlwind of activity. Sawing, hammering, shouting into his phone. He had friends over sometimes, other men built like him, and their laughter was a booming, foreign language that echoed off the brick walls of my sanctuary. They drank beer on his porch steps, and the smell of grilled meat would drift through my open window, a taunting reminder of a world of easy camaraderie that I did not belong to. In these moments, I perceived him as arrogant, a man so comfortable in his own skin that he never considered the space, both physical and auditory, that he occupied. He was an antagonist in a story I was writing in my head, the loud, brutish neighbor who shattered my concentration and represented a life of thoughtless physicality. And then, one Tuesday afternoon, the story shifted. I was at my window, staring blankly at the screen, wrestling with a design concept that refused to cooperate. My gaze drifted, as it always did, across the courtyard. And I saw him. He was standing by his own window, the one that looked directly into mine. He wasn't moving. He wasn't on his phone. He was just standing there, a mug in his hand, looking back at me. A hot, prickling wave of shame and panic washed over me. My heart became a frantic, trapped bird, beating its wings against the cage of my ribs. How long had he been standing there? How many times had he seen me, the strange, quiet man in the window, watching him? The dynamic shifted in an instant. I was no longer the unseen observer. I was the observed, the weirdo, the creepy neighbor. I yanked my blinds shut with a clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. My face burned. For the rest of the day, I felt his gaze on my apartment, a physical pressure against the drawn blinds. The distance I had so carefully maintained, the one-way mirror through which I viewed him, had been shattered. Now we were just two people in windows, watching each other, and the thought was unbearable. The storm arrived 2 weeks later, a brooding, purple-gray monster that swallowed the sky. It had been the talk of the local news for days, a tempest of biblical proportions churning its way toward us. I'd stocked up on bottled water and non-perishable food, not out of genuine fear, but out of a slavish devotion to routine and preparation. Control the variables you can. That was my mantra. The weather, however, was a variable far beyond my control. The first sign of trouble was a flicker. The lamp on my desk blinked once, twice, then held steady. I ignored it, pushing deeper into my work, a tight deadline for a branding project breathing down my neck. The rain began as a whisper, a soft patter against the glass, but soon grew into a roar. It was a solid sheet of water, blurring the world outside my window into an impressionist painting of greens and browns. Then the wind came, a howling, furious thing that rattled the window frames and sounded like a predator circling my small apartment. The lights flickered again, this time more violently. My computer monitor sputtered. I saved my work with frantic flying fingers. Then, with a final, apologetic hum, my world plunged into absolute darkness and a profound, ringing silence. The roar of the storm outside seemed to amplify, rushing in to fill the void left by the death of electricity. My laptop screen was the only source of light, its battery icon a cruel, mocking symbol of my dwindling time. 78%. Maybe 3 hours if I was lucky. Not enough. I sat there for a long time, the bluish glow of the screen illuminating my face. The comfortable solitude of my apartment had curdled into something else. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage. Cold. Dark. The silence was broken by the scream of the wind and the percussive drumming of the rain. My carefully constructed world had been dismantled in an instant. The anxiety that always simmered just beneath my skin began to boil, a familiar, sickening heat in my stomach. The deadline was tomorrow morning. Without power, I was sunk. My career, my rent, my entire life was tied to that glowing rectangle of light, and its life force was draining away. A loud, jarring bang echoed from my front door. It was so sudden, so violent that I nearly jumped out of my skin. My heart hammered against my ribs. Who'll be out in this? Another bang, harder this time. It wasn't the tentative knock of a delivery person. It was insistent. Urgent. I crept toward the door, my bare feet silent on the cold floorboards. I peered through the peephole, my breath held tight in my chest. The distorted, fisheye lens showed me a figure shrouded in the rain, broad and imposing. Julian. My first thought was irrational panic. He's here to complain. About the blinds. About me watching him. He's angry. I stood frozen, hoping he would just go away. But he knocked again, a solid thud of a large fist against wood. I could hear his voice, muffled by the door and the storm. Hello? Lau? You in there? He knew my name. Of course, he knew my name. It was on a mailbox. Still, hearing him say it sent a strange tremor through me. Taking a deep, shaky breath, I unlocked the door and opened a crack. The wind tore at it, trying to rip it from my grasp. Julian stood on my doorstep, rain plastering his dark hair to his forehead, dripping from his nose and chin. He was wearing a heavy-duty rain slicker that made him look even bigger, more substantial. He didn't look angry. He just looked wet. Power's out for the whole block, he shouted over the wind. Probably be out all night. I just nodded, my throat too tight to speak. Look, he said, shifting his weight. He seemed almost hesitant. About a generator running. Got lights, heat, internet. He jerked a thumb back toward his house, a warm, inviting square of light in the churning darkness. You work from home, right? Figured you might need power. You can come over. If you want. Charge your stuff. The offer hung in the air between us, suspended in the rain-soaked wind. It was a lifeline. It was also my worst nightmare. Leaving my fortress, entering his. But the image of my dying laptop battery, of the failed deadline, of the angry email from my client, was more terrifying. I had no choice. My carefully constructed world had failed me, and the one person I had actively avoided, the antagonist of my internal narrative, was offering me salvation. Okay, I managed to say, the word almost stolen by the wind. Yeah, okay. Thank you. Grab your stuff, he said, already turning to go. I'll leave the door unlocked, and just like that, he was gone, jogging back across the 50 feet of brick that had always seemed like an ocean, leaving me standing in my dark, cold apartment with a decision that had already been made for me. The walls of my castle had been breached. His house was nothing like I had imagined. My mind, prone to melodrama, had painted it as some kind of hypermasculine den, cluttered with tools and smelling of stale beer. The reality was jarringly different. It was clean, sparsely furnished, yes, but immaculate. The air smelled of freshly sawn wood, a clean, sharp scent that clung to everything, overlaid with a rich, dark aroma of brewing coffee. It was the smell of industry, but also of comfort. The generator hummed from somewhere outside, a steady, reassuring drone that powered a few strategically placed lamps. They cast a warm, golden glow, creating pools of light in the shadows. It felt intimate, like a pocket of civilization carved out of the raging storm. Julian was in the kitchen, his back to me, pouring coffee into two heavy ceramic mugs. The rain slicker was gone, and he was in a plain gray t-shirt that stretched across the solid muscle of his back. I stood awkwardly in the entryway, my laptop bag clutched in my hand like a shield. "You can set up on the dining table," he said over his shoulder, not turning around. "Outlet's right there." I did as I was told, my movements stiff and uncertain. I felt like an intruder, a foreign element in his space. The dining table was a massive piece of wood, clearly handmade, its surface smooth and scarred with the marks of use. I plugged in my laptop. The small green light on the power cord a beacon of profound relief. I was safe. My deadline was safe. He walked over and placed one of the mugs on the table beside my computer. "Cream and sugar are on the counter," he said. His voice was a low rumble, quieter indoors, stripped of the need to compete with the elements or the noise of his work. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely a whisper. My fingers went to wrap around the mug, and, as they did, his were just pulling away. The tips of my fingers brushed against the back of his hand. It was nothing, a fleeting, accidental contact, but a jolt, sharp and electric, shot on my arm. His skin was warm, rough with calluses. The shock of it was so intense, so unexpected, that I snatched my hand back as if burned. My heart did that stupid, frantic bird thing again. Panic, hot and immediate, flooded my system. "Don't be weird. Don't be weird." I stared down at the table, my face burning, certain he had noticed my ridiculous overreaction. But when I risked a glance up, he was just looking at me, his expression unreadable in the dim light. There was no mockery in his eyes, just a quiet, steady gaze. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and walked back to the kitchen. I spent the next hour working, trying to force my brain to focus on color palettes and font pairings. But I was hyper-aware of him. Every sound he made, the clink of a spoon against a cup, the soft thud of his boots as he walked across the wood floor, the quiet rustle of a page turning, registered in my brain with startling clarity. He was sitting in an armchair in the living room, reading a book, his large frame folded into the chair. The sight was so incongruous with the image I'd built of him, the loud, brash workman, that it was disorienting. I noticed things I couldn't see from my window. A faint, silvery scar that cut through his left eyebrow. The way his brow furrowed in concentration as he read. The sheer size of his hands, holding the paperback book with a strange gentleness. He wasn't the caricature I had created. He was just a quiet man in a quiet house, reading a book while a storm raged outside. My concentration finally broke when my laptop charger sputtered and died. The little green light went out. I jiggled the cord, my stomach sinking. Nothing. I traced the wire from the power brick and found it, a section near the plug where the rubber casing had frayed, exposing the delicate wires within. It was a problem I'd been meaning to fix, meaning to replace, but my talent for procrastination had finally caught up with me at the worst possible moment. A wave of despair washed over me. To be saved, only to be foiled by a $5 piece of equipment. It was a cruel cosmic joke. I must have made a sound, a small, frustrated sigh, because Julian looked up from his book. "Something wrong?" he asked. "My charger," I said, the words tasting like defeat. "It's broken." He unfolded himself from the chair and came over to the table. He knelt, his proximity making the air feel thick and hard to breathe. He took the frayed end of the cord from my hand, his fingers brushing mine again. This time, I didn't pull away. I just let the warmth of his touch linger for a fraction of a second too long. He examined the wire with a professional eye. The connection's shot, he said, his voice a low rumble next to me. But I can fix it. Before I could protest or thank him, he stood up, the cord in his hand. Be right back, he said, and disappeared through a door that I assumed led to a garage or a workshop. I was left alone in his living room, surrounded by the scent of him, the quiet evidence of his life. I was in his debt twice over now. He was no longer just my neighbor. He was my rescuer. And this realization shifted the very ground beneath my feet. The carefully constructed hierarchy I had imagined, with me as the quiet intellectual and him as the simple laborer, had crumbled. He was the one with the power, the knowledge, the tangible skills, and he was using them to help me. The dynamic between us had been irrevocably altered. He returned about 10 minutes later. In his hands was my charger, the frayed end now neatly and securely wrapped in black electrical tape. It was a solid, professional-looking repair. He plugged it into the wall and then into my laptop. The little green light blinked on, a tiny star in the dim room. There, he said. The word was simple, but it felt heavy with meaning. Should hold Julian. Thank you, I said, looking up at him. Seriously, you saved me. He just shrugged, a slight lift of his massive shoulders, but he didn't move away. He stood there by the table, looking down at me. What is it you do, anyway? He asked, his voice laced with genuine curiosity. All that time on the computer, I'm a graphic designer, I told him. Branding, logos, that kind of thing, he nodded slowly. So you make things, he said. Just on a screen? I guess so, I said, a small smile touching my lips. And you make things. With your hands, yeah, he said, a ghost of smile on his own face. I guess we both do. The storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, its fury intensified. The wind shrieked, and the rain hammered against the roof in a relentless, deafening rhythm. The idea of crossing the 50 feet of courtyard back to my cold, dark apartment seemed not only unpleasant, but genuinely dangerous. The unspoken reality settled between us. I was staying the night. The work was done. I'd sent the final files to my client just before the deadline, the repaired charger holding strong. A profound sense of relief washed over me, followed immediately by a fresh wave of anxiety. The purpose for my being here was gone. Now I was just here, a guest, an intruder. The silence in the house stretched, no longer comfortable, but filled with a buzzing, nervous energy. Julian had retreated back to his armchair, but he wasn't reading anymore. He was just watching the storm through the window, his profile etched by the lamplight. The house, which had at first felt spacious, now seemed to shrink around us. We were two people trapped in a small, warm bubble while the world raged outside. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh, every shift in weight was magnified. I could feel his presence as a physical weight in the room. I was intensely aware of the space between us, a gulf of about 10 feet that felt both immense and easily crossable. My heart was a low, steady drum against my ribs. He was the one who broke the silence. He turned his head away from the window and looked directly at me. His gaze was steady, unwavering. You know, he began, his voice low and even. I see you in your window sometimes. My stomach plummeted into a cold, dark abyss. The air left my lungs in a rush. This was it. The confrontation I had been dreading for weeks. The accusation. You're the weirdo who watches me. I braced myself, my hands clenching into fists under the table. But he didn't continue with an accusation. He continued with something far more shocking. You always look so focused, he said, his brow furrowed slightly. Like you're in your own world. Content, he paused, looking down at his large hands, then back at me. To be honest, he said, the words coming out slowly, as if he were pulling them from a deep well. I was jealous. The word hung in the air. Jealous. It was so far from what I had expected that my brain couldn't process it for a moment. Jealous of me? Of my quiet, empty life? It made no sense. This house gets big, he went on, gesturing vaguely to the shadowed corners of the room. And quiet. When I'm not working. My work, it's just me and the wood most days. It's isolating. He finally admitted it. The thing I had been so wrong about. He wasn't the king of a loud, boisterous world. He was just as solitary as I was. I'd see you over there, in your little square of light, and it looked peaceful, like you knew exactly where you were supposed to be. He wasn't watching me with anger or suspicion. He was watching me with longing. The confession was so raw, so unexpected, that it cracked something open inside me. His vulnerability was a key, unlocking a door I hadn't even realized was sealed shut. And my own confession tumbled out, unbidden. I was jealous of you, too. I heard myself say, the words feeling foreign and loud in the quiet room. He looked up, his eyes wide with surprise. Your life seems so full. I explained, the words coming faster now. Real. You build things, tangible things. You have friends. I hear you laughing. My life is just pixels on a screen. It's quiet because it's empty. I watched you because you seemed to have everything I didn't. We stared at each other across the dimly lit room, our mutual, mistaken envy laid bare between us. We were two lonely men, living parallel lives, each convinced the other held the secret to happiness. The irony was so thick, it was almost suffocating. The space between us was no longer empty. It was charged, humming with the energy of everything left unsaid, of years of silent observation and misunderstanding. He stood up from his chair. He moved slowly, deliberately, closing the 10-foot gap between us until he was standing in front of my chair. He was so tall, he blocked out the light from the lamp behind him, casting me in his shadow. My heart was a wild, frantic thing now, a hummingbird trapped in a shoebox. He didn't say anything. He just looked down at me, and the confident mask he wore for the world was gone. In its place was a raw, aching vulnerability that mirrored my own. I could see the fear in his eyes, but I could also see the want, the need. He reached out, his movements hesitant, and gently cupped my jaw. His thumb brushed against my cheek, the callous skin a startling, abrasive comfort. His touch was a question. My entire body went still. I could have pulled away. I could have broken the spell. Every instinct for self-preservation, every wall I had ever built, screamed at me to retreat to the safety of my solitude. But I didn't. I leaned into his touch, a barely perceptible movement, but it was enough. It was my answer. His eyes fluttered shut for a second, a silent exhalation of relief. He leaned down, slowly, giving me every possible second to change my mind. The world narrowed to the space between our lips. The roar of the storm outside faded to a distant whisper. There was only the scent of him, sawdust and coffee and rain, and the heat of his hand on my skin. The kiss, when it finally came, was nothing like I could have imagined. It wasn't frantic or passionate. It was slow, tentative, a soft, questioning pressure of his lips against mine. It was a kiss of profound and staggering honesty. It was a confirmation of everything we had just confessed, a silent acknowledgement of our shared loneliness, our shared longing. It was the closing of a distance I once thought was infinite. And in that moment, in the heart of the storm, I felt the foundations of my carefully constructed world crumble away, not in a terrifying collapse, but in a quiet, welcome surrender. I woke to the unfamiliar silence of a house that wasn't mine. The storm had passed. The aggressive drumming of the rain was gone, replaced by the soft, gentle dripping of water from the eaves. A pale, gray morning light filtered through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. For a moment, I was disoriented, my mind struggling to place the heavy wooden beams of the ceiling above me. Then, the memory of the night before came rushing back, a tidal wave of heat and sensation and raw, terrifying honesty. I was on his couch. A thick wool blanket was tucked around me, and a pillow was bunched under my head. I hadn't made it to a bed. After the kiss, after a series of softer, more searching kisses that followed, we had simply stopped. We sat on the couch, not touching, the air thick with the monumental thing that had just happened, until I had drifted off, exhausted by the emotional whiplash. But Julian was gone. The armchair he had occupied was empty. The house was still, save for the hum of the refrigerator. The power was back on. I sat up, the blanket pooling around my waist. My heart, which had felt so full and steady the night before, began to shrink, to tighten into a familiar, cold knot of anxiety. He was gone. A piece of paper, torn from a notepad, was sitting on the massive coffee table. His handwriting was a strong, masculine scrawl. For words. Coffee's made. Went to work, and that was it. No mention of the night before. No, we need to talk. No, that was amazing. Just a practical, logistical statement. Coffee. Work. The intimacy of the storm-shrouded night had evaporated with the morning light, leaving behind only the stark, awkward reality. My anxiety, a patient predator, began to circle. It was a mistake. The thought was sharp, painful, a fluke, a moment of weakness brought on by the storm, the proximity, the confessions. He regrets it. He fled at the first opportunity. The narrative my brain constructed was swift and brutal. He was a man of action, not words or feelings. He'd woken up, seen me on his couch, and felt a surge of regret, of awkwardness. He'd left for work, for the comfortable, tangible world of wood and nails, to escape the messy, complicated emotional landscape we had stumbled into. The shame was a physical thing, a hot flush that started in my chest and spread through my entire body. I had been so open, so vulnerable. I had let him see the lonely, wanting core of me. And he had run. I felt like a fool. A desperate, pathetic fool. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't drink his coffee. I couldn't bear to be in his space, a space that now felt like a crime scene, the evidence of my emotional recklessness strewn all around. I scrambled to my feet, gathering my laptop, my phone, my newly repaired charger. I folded the wool blanket with a precision born of panic, placing it squarely in the center of the couch cushions. I didn't belong here. I had overstayed my welcome. As I slipped out his front door, which he had, as promised, left unlocked, the morning air was cold and clean, washed new by the storm. My own apartment across the courtyard looked exactly the same, but it felt different. My fortress, my sanctuary. I fled to it, locking the door behind me with a decisive click. But the silence that greeted me was no longer a comfort. It was an accusation. It echoed with the ghost of his presence, with the memory of his confession, with the phantom touch of his lips on mine. My solitude had returned, but it was tainted now, haunted by the profound and aching absence of the man across the way. The first day was a study in self-torture. I kept the blinds on my main window closed, but I would creep over to the side window, the one that offered a sliver of a view of his driveway, and I would watch for his truck. An obsessive, compulsive ritual. Each time a vehicle passed on the street, my heart would leap with a sickening mix of hope and dread. I replayed our conversation, the kiss, over and over in my head, dissecting every word, every gesture, searching for the clue I must have missed, the sign that it was all a mistake. My mind was a relentless prosecutor, and I was the star witness, testifying against my own foolish heart. His truck rumbled into the driveway late in the afternoon. I watched from my hiding place as he got out. He looked tired. He stretched, his back arching, and ran a hand through his hair. He didn't look toward my apartment. His gaze was fixed on his own front door. He went inside, and the house that had been a beacon of warmth and safety the night before was once again just a structure of wood and brick, closed off to me. The silence was absolute. No text, no call, no knock on the door, nothing. The 50 feet of courtyard might as well have been 1,000 miles. Every hour that passed was another shovelful of dirt on the grave of whatever had happened between us. My anxiety spiraled into a dark, suffocating vortex. I had imagined it all, or worse, I hadn't imagined it, and it had meant nothing to him. I was a momentary diversion, a curiosity, a story he might one day tell his friends, laughing. The weird, quiet guy from across the way. The second day was even worse. The silence had solidified. It was a physical presence in my apartment, a heavy, suffocating blanket. I couldn't work. I couldn't read. I couldn't think. I just existed, a ghost in my own home, haunted by the man who was just a stone's throw away but completely, utterly out of reach. My quiet, orderly life was in ruins. He had breached the walls of my fortress, not with a battering ram, but with a simple act of kindness, and had shown me what lay outside, a world of connection and vulnerability that I had, for one brief, shining moment, been a part of. And now, the gates have been slammed shut, leaving me on the outside, looking in at a memory. The solitude I had once cultivated as a shield now felt like a punishment. It was no longer peaceful. It was just empty. On the third night, just as I was resigning myself to the new, miserable status quo, there was a knock on my door. It wasn't the urgent, storm-driven banging of before. It was a softer sound, hesitant. 3 quiet raps. My heart stopped. It couldn't be. I stood frozen in the middle of my living room, my breath caught in my throat. Another 3 knocks, just as gentle, just as uncertain. I moved toward the door as if in a trance. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. I didn't look through the peephole. I knew who it was. I just pulled the door open. Julian stood on my doorstep. He looked worse than I felt. There were dark, bruised-looking circles under his eyes, and a 2-day growth of stubble shadowed his jaw. He wasn't wearing his confident, capable mask. He just looked exhausted and profoundly nervous. In his large, calloused hands, he was holding a small terracotta pot. A tiny, lopsided succulent was planted in it, looking just as awkward and out of place as he did. He didn't say hello. He just launched into it, the words tumbling out in a low, rough voice. "I'm sorry." He wouldn't meet my eyes, his gaze fixed on the potted plant in his hands. "For just leaving that morning, and for not saying anything. I'm an idiot." He finally looked up, and his eyes were filled with a desperate, pleading vulnerability that shattered my anger and my fear. "I panicked," he said, the admission a raw whisper. "I woke up, and you were there, and it was all real. And it scared the hell out of me." He took a deep breath. "I don't do that," he said, with a vague, helpless gesture between us. "Feel things. Or I do, I don't know what to do with them. I just know how to build things and fix things. And I didn't want to break this, whatever this is. So I ran. I went to work, and I just worked until I couldn't think anymore." Which was stupid, his confession, his fear. It was a mirror of my own. All the brutal narratives I had constructed, all the self-recrimination, it all dissolved in the face of his own terrified, fumbling honesty. He hadn't run from me. He had run from the sheer, overwhelming force of what he was feeling. I stepped back, pulling the door open wider. "Come in," I said, my voice hoarse. He stepped inside my apartment, my space for the first time. He looked around, his eyes taking in my world of books and screens and quiet order. He seemed too big for the room, a creature the outdoors brought inside. He was still holding the succulent as if it were a shield. We stood there in an awkward silence for a moment, the air thick with everything that had happened and everything that hadn't been said. "I thought you regretted it." I confessed, my voice quiet. "I thought it was a mistake." His head snapped toward me, his eyes wide with alarm. "No," he said, the word forceful, absolute. "God, no. Lau." It wasn't a mistake. He took a step closer to me. It was the only thing that's felt real in a very long time. That's why it scared me. And there it was. The truth. We were both terrified. We were 2 people who had built fortresses of solitude around ourselves for so long that the prospect of letting someone else inside was both a desperate desire and a paralyzing fear. We had to have the clarifying conversation, the one that acknowledged the fear but chose to move forward anyway. He looked at the sad little succulent in his hands. "This is dumb," he said, a self-deprecating smile touching his lips. He walked over to my window, the one I always sat at, the one that looked out onto his house, and he placed a pot on the sill. I figured," he said, his back to me, "you should have something else to look at besides me." I felt a smile bloom on my own face, a genuine, unburdened smile. I walked over to stand beside him at the window. We looked out at the courtyard, at his house, a mirror image of this moment. Then he did something that made my breath catch in my throat. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his keys, a heavy, jangling ring. He methodically worked one of them off the ring. It was a simple brass key. He turned to me and held it out, placing it on the palm of my hand. The metal was warm from his body. "In case the power goes out again," he said, his voice low and steady, his eyes locked on mine. "Or, for whatever a key." It was so much more than a key. It was an invitation, a promise. It was an act of trust, a tangible symbol of his intention to dismantle his own fortress, and a request for me to do the same. It was the most eloquent, romantic thing anyone had ever done for me. And I knew, as I closed my hand around the solid, reassuring weight of it, that this was not an ending. This was the real beginning. The mornings are different now. They begin not with the jarring rumble of his truck, but with the soft, warm weight of him beside me in bed. His bed. My side of it is the one closest to the window, the one that looks out at my own empty apartment across the way. The view is a constant reminder of a life I used to live, a life that feels like it belonged to someone else entirely. The house no longer feels like his space that I'm intruding upon. It's becoming ours. My favorite mug sits next to his on the counter. My book is on the nightstand. The air still smells of sawdust and coffee, but now it's just the smell of morning. It's the smell of home. We are quiet people, it turns out. The booming laughter I used to hear from his porch was a performance, a projection of the easy camaraderie he thought he was supposed to have. With me, the silence is different. It's not empty. It's a comfortable, shared space, filled with the small sounds of a life being lived together. The scrape of a fork on a plate, the rustle of a newspaper, the soft thud of his feet on the floor. Sometimes I wake up before him. I lie there and watch him sleep, the morning light tracing the lines of his face. I see the scar through his eyebrow, the faint lines of exhaustion that are always there, and I feel a surge of something so fierce, so protective, it almost hurts. This man, who I once saw as an obstacle, an antagonist, has become the most vulnerable, most precious part of my world. The physical space between us has vanished. His hand will find the small of my back as we pass in the narrow hallway. My head will find its way to his shoulder when we sit on the couch. Touch is our primary language, a constant, low-level conversation that says all the things we struggle to put into words. You are here. I am here. We are safe. I still work from my apartment sometimes. I like the separation. But now, when I sit at my desk, the little succulent he gave me is always in my line of sight. It's thriving, surprisingly. And when I look out the window, I no longer see a stranger. I see home. I see him moving around in the kitchen, making us dinner. And sometimes, he'll look up, and he'll see me watching. And he'll smile. A real smile, not just for the world, but for me. And I'll smile back. There are no more secrets, no more misunderstandings. Just an open window and a shared gaze. My life was once a fortress designed to keep the world out, to protect me from the risk of getting hurt. I thought my solitude was a strength, a sign of my self-sufficiency. But it was a prison, a cage built of fear. I was the lonely king of an empty castle. Julian wasn't a threat to my world. He was a key. He was the plot twist I never saw coming, the unexpected variable that shattered all my carefully laid plans and forced me to build something new. He didn't tear down my walls with force. He just stood outside them, patiently, holding a cup of coffee and a repaired charger, and showed me that it was safe to come out. He showed me that the most beautiful things in life aren't built from pixels on a screen, but from the messy, terrifying, wonderful work of connecting with another human being. The quiet man I used to be is still in here, somewhere. But he's no longer alone. He's part of a we, and that has made all the difference. Have you ever completely misjudged someone, only to find out they were nothing like you imagined? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this and want to hear more stories about finding connection in the most unexpected of places, please consider subscribing to the channel for more.